In this section, we'll talk about the relationship between climate change and displacement through the lens of political ecology. In policy circles, in academic studies, and also in the mass media, this relationship is increasingly being discussed and debated. For example, in this recent Reuters article published in March 2021, it details a report by the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent that estimated about 10.3 million people were displaced by climate change-induced events such as flooding and droughts over the previous 6 months, with the majority of them in Asia. They contrast this with 2.3 million people being displaced by conflict during the same period. More local reporting is also documenting the climate change risks. For example, this article in the Bangkok Post from 2016 that was estimating that Bangkok could be submerged in 15 years according to a study at the time. In recognition that there's a growing number of people whose decision to migrate is influenced by environmental change, this has led to important questions about how to define this new group of migrants. The International Organization for Migration, for example, in 2007 wrote that environmental migrants are persons or groups of persons who, for compelling reasons of sudden or progressive changes in the environment that adversely affect their lives or living conditions, are obliged to leave their habitual homes or choose to do so, either temporarily or permanently, and who move either within their country or abroad. They furthermore categorize the environmental migrants into 3 types: environmental emergency migrants, environmentally forced migrants, and environmentally motivated migrants. Regarding environmental emergency migrants, this refers to people who flee the worst of an environmental impact on a temporary basis, for example, due to hurricanes or tsunamis or earthquakes. Environmentally forced migrants, meanwhile, are people who have to leave in order to avoid the worst of environmental degradation. In this case, there's a degree of socioeconomic factors that are taken into consideration in the decision to migrate. Finally, regarding environmentally motivated migrants, these are a group of migrants whose decision to migrate is influenced by their anticipation of upcoming environmental change in the future that doesn't necessitate their immediate migration, but eventually would necessitate it. From a political ecology perspective, these definitions alone do not account for the politics of the environmental change, or how risk and vulnerability is being generated through decision-making processes. Reflecting the growing recognition of environmental migration as a phenomenon, there's now also a growing number of academic studies, both trying to understand environmental migration as a process, as well as how environmental migrants might decide to migrate or not, as for example in this study by Renaud et al. In 2011. In a second example, this is a study by Richard Black and colleagues, also published in 2011, that draws upon DFID's sustainable livelihood framework and essentially asks, how does environmental change as a driver act upon the dimensions of sustainable livelihood and ultimately the decision to migrate or stay? So this perspective is useful, although political ecology would ask more critical questions of the way in which environmental change occurs, and including the differentiated experience of risk and hazard and how it shapes mobility. With the growing number of studies documenting the potentially large number of people who could be displaced for environmental reasons, this also raises a question of what would be the state policy response. One potential direction that we can see emerging is a securitization of these environmental or climate migrants, which is framed around a narrative of a spectre of mass migration. In this type of narrative, environmental migrants are seen as problems in the sense that they will create competition for scarce resources and require economic support, as well as competing for jobs and drawing demands on social infrastructure in the places where they seek to migrate to. This leads to policy recommendations that essentially would regulate the movement of environmental migrants, and in essence this would reinforce their vulnerability. A political ecology approach problematizes this narrative as essentially blaming migrants for living in risky places rather than understanding the wider context as to why they end up living in risky places in the first place. It also seeks to frame migration as something that is unusual, but in many places, including in Southeast Asia, migration is already a common phenomenon. And in fact, migration can be seen as a risk reduction strategy in terms of vulnerability, for example, in the way that households may spread the risk across multiple locations by having family members in different places, as well as the ability to move away from a particular place when disaster strikes as being an example of agency. In a political ecology perspective, by emphasizing the ability of migrants to move as being a response to living in risky places, it also emphasizes the duty of states to support these people rather than blame them. In the second half of this session, I will now present a case study of flooding and migration or displacement through a political ecology lens. Very important to the approach of political ecology is to avoid overarching generalizations and try and be specific. In particular, in this case, both in terms of the types of flooding that might occur, as well as the types of migration and how they interact together. So, taking Southeast Asia as a case study, often flooding is framed to be catastrophic, and it can be, especially if it occurs in urban areas. But at the same time, regular seasonal flooding is also beneficial, especially in rural areas, for example, in the way that it nourishes soil for agriculture, and it's also a part of sustaining ecosystems and their patterning that is important for river-related resources such as wild capture fisheries. So in other words, when we think about the distribution of harms and benefits, it actually depends upon the type of flood that occurs and the person who's experiencing it. As I mentioned in the previous slide, a political ecology approach tries to be more specific in the way that we think about both migration and flooding. So to briefly talk about different types of migration, this could be local or cross-border or even transnational. It could be short or long-term or permanent, or it could be circular, involving seasonal movements that might relate to agricultural practices. And it could be multi-local livelihood in the sense that some family members remain at home whilst others migrate away and send remittances back, or it could involve an entire household moving. In terms of these overall strategies towards migration, they could reduce or increase vulnerability, or it could be both at the same time, where one type of vulnerability is replaced for another type. Regarding flooding, as I mentioned in the previous slide, flooding may be beneficial or negative depending on who experiences it. There are many different types of flood. For example, seasonal floodplain inundation or irregular riverbank overflows. There could be flash floods that occur either in urban areas or in mountainous areas, with the latter that could also be associated with risky landslides. And there could also be coastal flooding that relates to tidal patterns, and then also that connects to inland river flows under different conditions. To unpack a little bit more about people's vulnerability to flooding, we need to recognize that vulnerability reflects a larger story of socioeconomic and political inequality. In general, we could say that destructive floods tend to disproportionately affect marginalized groups who hold less political or social power within society. The effects of floods can be mitigated, or they can be exacerbated by institutionalized disaster response strategies, or the lack of them, These vulnerabilities are also shaped by long-term development planning policies. For example, policies that have expanded agriculture leading to deforestation, or that have supported the expansion of water management infrastructure that stores water with the goal of better managing it, but under extreme weather events can actually increase the risks of flooding, having to release water for emergency conditions. Louis Lebel, in a recent paper, offered this insight: the strategies for risk reduction for some often result in risk redistribution to others. Overall, we need to understand flooding as a hazard, not as a totally natural phenomenon, but something that is also produced through socio-political processes. Turning now to a couple of ways in which floods connect to migration or mobility. The first thing to recognize is that flooding alone does not determine migration. There are many other influential factors that could motivate or discourage migration. For example, the effects of flooding on mobility may depend on whether or not the impacts of the floods exceed an acceptable level, as well as whether a household has other in situ options to turn to. In other circumstances, we might find that floods actually reduce mobility. For example, when disastrous flooding impacts transportation systems. There may be circumstances where voluntary relocation in response to a high or a rising risk of floods could be a strategy for some households who have sufficient resources to be able to move. But their decision will also be influenced by other social considerations, perhaps including emotional attachment to a particular place. Lastly, there are examples that we could find across Southeast Asia and beyond where government policies can be a source of risk in itself. For example, there are cases where governments have tried to move people away from places that flood to somewhere safe, but where those people have been moved to actually lack livelihood options. So in that sense, one source of vulnerability to flooding, has been substituted for a different form of vulnerability, economic vulnerability, due to a lack of livelihood options. Turning now to the consequences of migration on vulnerabilities to flooding, I'd like to summarize just a couple of the key findings from our recently published edited volume titled Living with Floods in a Mobile Southeast Asia, that was a political ecology of vulnerability, migration, and environmental change. So we found that there are significant impacts by floods on migrants that move to flood-prone areas of major cities. These include, for example, damage to assets, loss of employment that could be formal or informal, as well as health risks. We also found that floods impact some migrants much more than others, and generally migrants are more vulnerable than other residents in a particular area. We found that the reduction of vulnerability depended upon the ability to draw on social capital and networks both in the source and the destination locations of the migrant. We also found that risk was reduced when people could access information about flooding. But for cross-border migrants who may not speak the local language as well or have access to locally available information about flooding may not be readily available. And finally, we found that migrants may stay in high-risk flooding environments because the benefits outweigh the costs. For example, in areas prone to flooding, accommodation becomes more affordable. It may also be closer to the employment that they have. But overall, similar to the conclusion of the previous slide, what we see is that one form of vulnerability is being substituted for another.